So, without further delay, I give you Dr. Jacques Gauthier. Who is muted.
In North America, okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
So I first of all, I want to wish Shana Tova to my friends in North America, to all of those who are going to be participating in this Zoom lecture, those who are in Israel, other parts of the world. I consider this a real privilege. I'm a repository of information which has been collected and assembled for decades, and I've come to certain conclusions which I believe are exceedingly relevant. They've been relevant throughout the last decades, but particularly now, as we see the machinations of the nations once more. The traditional anti-Semitism has been transformed, has taken the guise of anti-Zionism, and it's rampant in the corridors of the United Nations in New York and Geneva, in parliaments of different nations. And it's a time to counter the false narratives relating to the legitimacy of Israel to its own territory, the legitimacy of the claims in respect to all of Jerusalem and the disputed territories. In fact, I believe that, we seem to be getting further and further away from a peaceful resolution of this conflict that's been going on for a century or more. And I believe that if there is a pathway to peace, it should be through the recognition of the legitimate rights that have been granted to the Jewish people, to Israel, in respect to the territories in question. I have spent years of my life, a big segment, it's in fact more like 30 years now, trying to answer a particular question. Who has legal title in international law to Jerusalem? And this is related to the disputed territories. Have decisions been made over the last decades that settled this question? After looking at literally hundreds of documents, books, and articles, I put together the puzzle. And for those of you today who will be surprised by my presentation of certain historical facts, certain historical events, and you will say, well, I wasn't really aware of the importance of those events. Well, I can understand, because it took me so long to put it together. In fact, in 2006, I defended the thesis I had worked on for over 20 years. And this thesis is 10 pounds, 1,300 pages, and it could have been twice as big, except I couldn't find a printing machine that would accommodate the printing. And frankly, when you look at the subject, it's sovereignty over the old city of Jerusalem. I started by focusing on Jerusalem, and then I realized that the ultimate bone of contention, and I'll come back to that, is in fact the old city. Why? The old city was Jerusalem until the end of the 19th century. If you look at the old city in the 15th century, in the 12th century, time of the Crusaders, throughout 2,000 years, it was essentially the configuration of the old city today. That's why it's such a bone of contention. That's what the claimants are really after. But the title is in fact a study of the historical, religious, political, and legal aspects of the question of the old city. You can't present findings and conclusions relating to either Jerusalem or the Holy Land, all components of everything that's on the west side of the Jordan River without paying attention to the history and the spiritual dimension of the questions, you don't understand the claims. You don't understand what people are after unless you look at the history and the spiritual connotations. Imagine having to summarize the connection between Jerusalem and the Jewish people. I needed decades just to do that. The literature is endless. And since this is a legal thesis, it's a document in international law, I couldn't have hundreds and hundreds of pages on this aspect alone, so I had to do executive summaries. So the link between Jerusalem and the Jewish people, you just look at the Bible. In the thesis, I've attached many tables. Each one is an executive summary of the links. There are links, of course, between Jerusalem and Christianity. And there are links between Jerusalem and Islam. Anybody that contends that Jerusalem is not holy, that the Holy Land is not holy for Muslims, for Christians, is presenting something that's not well-founded. There is a connection. It is holy, but it is only central. I'm talking about Jerusalem and the Holy Land. Only central in Judaism. Only central in the beliefs of the Jewish people. If you look at what I have reviewed, the center for Islam is Mecca. And the second holiest city, of course, is Medina. And the center, if you're a Christian, well, it may be Rome if you're Catholic. In fact, if you ever visit the Sistine Chapel, it's supposed to be a duplicate of the temple that was in Jerusalem, same dimensions, because the center was no longer Jerusalem, but Rome for them. So here we are. A question that is so thorny, so complex, so convoluted, and we're trying to reach legal conclusions. So let me say this. You've heard, we in the common law jurisdictions of the world that practice law as I have for decades, often use Latin expressions to emphasize certain points. And most of you are familiar with the expression nota bene, which means note well, which means I want to emphasize something. Well, today I'm going to use it on a number of occasions, and it's going to become nota multas bene. Note very well. So my plea to you is to pay attention to the historical events that I will be underlining, because they are the foundations of the legitimacy of the claims of the Jewish people to the entirety of the land west of the Jordan River, including the disputed territories, including all of Jerusalem. Bottom line, if you talk about the right of the Jewish people to settle in any part of Jerusalem or in the so-called West Bank, meaning Judea and Samaria, you have to ask the question, have the rights been given to the Jewish people to possess? Have the rights been given to have sovereignty? And if the answer is yes, which is my contention, then Jews, Israelis in any part of Jerusalem are not usurpers, they're not trespassers, they're not wrongdoers, they're not there illegally, they're there as of right. So today, I'm going to try to summarize what's in 1,300 pages of my thesis. And I would urge you to pay attention to some of the key events, because it's not enough for someone to have gathered the information, put it in a big book, having distributed the book here and there if the Jewish people of the world don't understand. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of what I've been through over the last years is the extent to which the Jewish people and the Israelis are divided on different delicate, crucial issues. I would submit that if my conclusions are well-founded, at the very least, let's begin by agreeing that the rights have been given. I'm not here to suggest that once you've got the right answers legally, you can solve all the problems. I realize that there are political ramifications galore, that it's a so complex situation that it can't be resolved by simply presenting my findings. But I stress again, the pathway to any solution is to recognize the Jewish rights, the legitimacy of the Israeli and Jewish rights to Jerusalem and all aspects of what is called the disputed territories, every component of it. All right, let us go over these very important facts. So you have an outline in front of you right now, a chart, which provides a summary of the nexus of the connection between these very crucial historical events. And you will note that in the center of it all is the San Remo Conference of 1920. You will see when I present the ramifications of that conference that it was a turning point, a defining moment. If you ask the simple question, when were the rights given? The answer is the San Remo Conference. So since I'm focusing on the legal aspects, let me say this as part of the introduction. If you have a legal disposition that is binding in any situation, what you need is, you need a tribunal that's duly empowered. You need a body that can make decisions, that has the right to make legal dispositions. You need that. You need parties that have standing in that case. They have to be allowed into the courtroom and given the stand, be allowed to speak. You need a recognized party, therefore. You need an opportunity to present the claims. In Canada, we call that document a statement of claim. So the moment when the parties present their case and their claims, you need for that to happen. And then you need a decision, a verdict, a judgment. I'm going to submit to you that all of those have taken place in regard to all the key components of the Ottoman territories, but in particular with regard to Palestine. The body, the tribunal, was the Supreme Council of the Allied Powers. Nota multa bene, the Supreme Council. The parties were the Arabs, on one hand, the Jewish people represented by the Zionist organization, the Turks, who stood there with the risk of losing their territories, and then there was another party that was recognized, and there were Syrians. And I'll come back to that. Those were the parties. The Arabs made their presentation in Paris on February 6, 1919. The Jews on February 27, 1919. And the Syrians during the same time period. The powers, the body that had the power of disposition, left Paris in mid-1919 and reconvened in the city of San Remo. And it was during the conference held in April of 1920 that they reached a verdict that they made the decisions. And that I'm going to present to you today. Balfour Declaration. If there's an event, if there's a fact historically that is generally better known than others, it's the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration was a decision, or was an act, not of a man, not of Balfour. It was the War Cabinet that in November 1917 made a very, very crucial decision. It is so relevant, and yet not necessarily for the reasons ascribed to it. Politically, you can imagine when the British Empire, mighty British Empire, states that they're going to be supportive of the Jewish Zionist aspirations relating to Palestine, that's something to write home about. Of course, it's important. It had huge effects. However, in 1917, the British did not possess Palestine, and they do not have legal title to Palestine. So what I want you to understand is that the Balfour Declaration is like an egg that was emitted, and it has to be fertilized. Unless the fertilization takes place, it doesn't become part of international law. It's a political act, very helpful to the Zionist movement in those days. Now, where are the aspirations? When you present a case, when you look at a decision, you gotta look at the goals and objectives of the parties. Well, it begins not with Theodor Herzl, because there were others who presented this solution to the Jewish problem in the past, including Hess and Pinsker and others, but it was Herzl who made the difference for the following reason. In 1896, the pamphlet was published, and you'll note the subtitle of the pamphlet. It's titled "The Jewish State, an Attempt at a Modern Solution to the Jewish Question." So here I need to emphasize the following. The Jewish question, the Jewish problem, was not just the problem of the Jews. It was the problem of the nations who had mistreated Jewish people historically. There was situation after situation where Jews were massacred in different countries. Jews were mistreated, were expelled from countries. The list is endless. And Herzl wrestled with this, and he was assimilated. He was successful. He was part of the upper echelons of his society. But then when he witnessed the treatment of Dreyfus in France, the trial of an innocent officer in the French army, all of a sudden things crystallized, and he realized the solution is not for us Jews to try to be the best citizens of each country we're in. No matter what we do, we still mistreat it. The solution is our own state, the Jewish state. It wasn't the pamphlet that made all the difference. It was the conference he organized a year later in 1897 in Basel, Switzerland. And I organized a conference there a number of years ago in the same hall where he gathered 200 people from all around the world. And then there was a miracle in that place in 1897. He succeeded in unifying the Jewish people to support the cause, the following cause. The aim was to create a Jewish homeland, a Jewish state. And he came out with a program in regard to that. And this is what the Balfour Declaration is all about. It's a response to those aspirations, those solutions, that solution a Jewish state, a Jewish state. Now, this slide shows you the Palestine in 1917. You'll see it was subdivided in Ottoman provinces. It wasn't known as Palestine. Paris Peace Conference, again, nota multas bene, a turning point. Why? Because it's in this particular place, the Quai d'Orsay in Paris, and you see it back in 1919 and today, that for 6 months, the powers, the Allied powers, and in particular the Supreme Council, the principal powers composed of France, Great Britain, the US, Italy, and Japan, interacted with the defeated nations in order to decide what the reparations would be, what the consequences would be. Here are the leaders of those 4 of the 5 nations: Lord George, Clemenceau, Wilson, Orlando. And I mentioned earlier, presentations were made, cases were presented. Faisal on February 6, 1919, Wiseman and his delegation on February 27. Very important dates. I should note that just before the start of the conference, an agreement was made. So important between Faisal and Wiseman. Can't go into the details, but the bottom line of that is that Faisal wanted a huge chunk of what had been Ottoman territories to become an Arab state. And he wanted the support of the Jewish people in that regard. And then, not only did he acknowledge that apart from the Arab state, there would be a Palestine, that would be the place where the wording of the Balfour Declaration is included here. They would be supportive of the settlement, of the immigration of Jews, of the establishment of a national home. That was just before these presentations. So February 6th, Faisal, in front of the 5 nations, remember, these are the key nations that have the power of disposition, makes his presentation, and gets the recognition as a party with respect to certain lands. He then outlines his aspirations for the independence of Arab people in many of the territories. But regarding Palestine, remember, he's just signed an agreement with Wiseman. He says, because of its character, we'll leave it to the side. He's not asking for Palestine to be part of the Arab independence. Here we are today. Nations are forgetting that the Arabs made a presentation, presented their statement of claim.
Marcia Hines should mute her microphone. Marcia Hines should mute her microphone.
Thank you. There was a sound that was a little disturbing. So back to the presentation, they're not asking for Palestine to be part of the Arab state. Then February 27, and I would respectfully submit again that this is a date that everyone, it's so important, should be aware of. That's when the Jewish delegation presents its case in front of the same 5 nations led by Wiseman. What do they want? They want recognition of the historic connection, the link between the Jewish people historically and the land of Palestine. In addition, they want a right to reconstitute what they used to have. Can you imagine if they were given a recognition of this? What the nations would have to take into consideration? What did the Jews have in the past? Because they have the right to reconstitute. Wow. Remember my study of Jerusalem, the centrality of Jerusalem for the Jewish people historically and in Judaism. They'd have to take that into consideration. They present a map with regard to the area that should be the Jewish state. And you see the map on one side, based on what they presented, coincides in many ways with the components of the Holy Land that were historically and from a religious point of view relevant for the Jewish people, including territory on the east side of the Jordan River. You remember 2.5 tribes got territories on that side. That was supposed to be part of what the Jewish people sought during the conference. We're going to see what happened. Covenant of the League of Nations. Again, a pillar. When you look at the legal aspects of this question, you need to understand that during the Paris Peace Conference, as a result of the vision and the determination of President Wilson and a few others, there was this vision of creating, for the first time, a very large international organization that would prevent another war. And you see the key objectives of this league. And it was adopted in 1919 and incorporated in the Treaty of Versailles of June 28, 1919. It's important in any analysis of legal rights because of Article 22. In this article, something without precedent is introduced. Instead of the victorious nations just taking over the territories of the defeated nations and making them part of their territory, there's a new system implemented or introduced, the mandate system, whereby sacred trusts are established in favor of people in certain territories who are not ready to be independent. This article supports the claims of the Jewish people because this sacred trust related also to Palestine. Just to give you a clear supportive treaty of the power of the 5 nations, what I'm looking for is a chain of title. I'm going to conclude, I have concluded, that title was given to the principal powers. And these powers turned around, and as far as Palestine is concerned, they gave it to the Jewish people. But they couldn't give to the Jewish people what wasn't there. Another Latin expression, nemutat quod non habet. You can't give what's not yours. So it's necessary for me to establish and prove to you that the powers got title and could give it to the Jewish people. This related to the treaty with the Germans, Treaty of Versailles, and they got title to some of their territories. This related, and this is another treaty relating to Austro-Hungarian territories that are also transferred, ceded to the 5 powers. Takes us to the San Remo Conference. How important this is. In 1919, there was a villa in San Remo that was owned privately, and it was set aside for a conference of the principal powers in April, an entire week of April 1920. And you see the villa as it is today. I've been there many times over the last years, and I was supposed to be there this year on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the conference. We had worked so hard to organize this event, and regrettably, because of the pandemic, the conference had to be canceled. So here we are. Remember I told you that one of the components to reach a binding decision, you need a verdict. Once you know that the body has the power of disposition and you've recognized some parties and they've made their presentation, then a decision is required. For 2 days in 1920, April 24, April 25, they gathered in that villa, deliberated as judges would do in a chamber, and made a decision. Here they are, the key leaders standing in front of the villa. And I can't sufficiently emphasize how relevant this decision is in international law. What was the decision? The decision was basically to take the policy, to take the principles of the Balfour Declaration and incorporate it into international law. Do you remember I said earlier that the Balfour Declaration was like an egg that had to be fertilized? That's the moment it is fertilized. Those with the power of decision make the decision and say yes to what was presented by the Zionist organization in Paris. They wanted the recognition of the historical connection between the Jewish people and Palestine. They got it. And you'll see in a moment that they even got the right to reconstitute what they used to have. What you need to understand also is that the rights that are given, this is another very important aspect, are given not just to the inhabitants of Palestine who are Jewish, they're given to the Jews worldwide. Amazingly, they become virtual inhabitants of that territory, as recognized here by Curzon, who was the Secretary of State who attended the conference. Now, important question you should be asking. If the principal powers are deciding to give rights to the Jewish people, rights to what territory? Well, they discussed it. They had a comprehensive discussion of the boundaries during the conference. And the minutes of that conference are attached to my thesis. 2 days, April 24, 25. Lord George, who was so supportive of the Jewish claims, said, well, we should give them from Dan to Beersheba. So the French guy, Millerand, said, well, very interesting, I just don't know what you're talking about. Well, responded Lloyd George, let me help you. I'm going to present to you a map that was put together by George Adam Smith. And it is a map of the territories of David and Solomon. And I submit that if we give the Jewish people those areas, then we will have recognized, duly recognized the links between the Jewish people and Palestine. That's the book with the map. And that's the map. A copy of that map should be printed and available all over the world for those who believe in the legitimacy of the presence and title of Israel to Jerusalem and any part of the Holy Land. The book is so important. I managed to get a copy, the original. I have an original. This is show and tell time. Here's the book. And in fact, I'm going to show you in the book the map that's on your screen. That's what Lord George presented. This is the map that you're looking at. That's what he presented to the Allies. And they agreed that that should be the basis, that should be the territory for the Jews. Here's a copy, or in the same book, there's a map of modern Jerusalem. Remember I told you? This is published in 1915, and look at Jerusalem back then. It's basically the old city. So today, when the nations want to divide Jerusalem on the basis of the Green Line, which was merely a line in the armistice agreement between Israel and Transjordan in 1949, meant for the parties to stop fighting at a particular point in the territory and specifying that no title rights, no sovereignty rights should flow out of this line. And yet today the nations are saying, divide Jerusalem and the disputed territories on the basis of the Green Line, which is not a source of rights for any of the parties. Furthermore, if you divide Jerusalem based on the Green Line, the entirety of the old city is taken away from the state of Israel and becomes part of the Palestinian capital. The real Jerusalem is no longer part of Israel. If you think I'm exaggerating the ramifications of the San Remo decision, look at what Wiseman, who was there, had to say. If you look at this, He says it's no exaggeration to say that this is the most important moment in our history since the exile. Do you think I was exaggerating? Since the exile, nothing's happened for the Jewish people that is more significant than the San Remo decision. So you can imagine that when I go and speak to places, I went to the Parliament of Japan, House of Lords in England, Congress in the US, the Parliament in Brussels, the European Parliament, and I present all of this, and most people have never heard of the San Remo Conference and its ramifications. This is the true narrative. When you read resolutions of the UN that repeat over and over again that Israel is contravening international law by possessing or establishing sovereignty rights in Jerusalem or any other part of the Holy Land, it's not well-founded in law. It's a false narrative. Treaty of Sept followed the San Remo Conference. That's with the Turks between the Supreme Council, without the US because they had not declared war on Turkey. And you will see that Article 95 of this international treaty makes reference to the Balfour Declaration principles that are now part of international law. And look at 132, Article 132. Please, please. Nota multas bene. Turkey renounces in favor of the Allied powers all rights and titles to the territories in question. This is a cession of title to those powers who can then turn around and give the rights to others. After that, there were agreements between the French and the British to finalize the boundaries between Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. The mandate for Palestine. Another very, very significant component of any analysis of the rights of the parties here. A treaty comes out of the San Remo Conference after the Treaty of Sept. Look at the first paragraph of the preamble. Here, you'll see it better this way. It says specifically that Turkey has renounced title in favor of the principal Allied powers over Palestine. Here's a copy of this document, which I like to refer to as the Charter of Rights, the Magna Carta of the Jewish people, where their rights are codified. Article 2 of that mandate specifies that the mandatory Great Britain, because in San Remo and in other meetings that they had, it was decided that Britain would be the mandatory or the trustee over Palestine and Iraq or Mesopotamia, and France would be the mandatory over Syria and Lebanon. So this is in accordance with the wishes of the Jewish people because they didn't want to be in a position of having to establish a Jewish state back then because the Jewish population of Palestine may have been 150, 200,000 compared to 700,000 Arabs. They wanted the right to immigrate and to have enough people there to establish their state. So here, there's recognition of the rights. In the revised mandate for Palestine, you will see in the preamble, if I go back, you'll see that there's a reference to the preamble. In the preamble, the historical connection requested in the presentation in Paris, February 27, is recognized, and the right to reconstitute what they used to have. What does that mean? That means if there was a very significant Jewish presence historically in Hebron, in Shiloh, in other parts, the Jews have the right to possess, they have the right to settle, they have the right to be there. And if they annex, they have that right too. If you compare the other mandates, it's clear that for Syria and Lebanon, the mandate was for the inhabitants, the Arab inhabitants. And for Iraq, same thing. But in the mandate for Palestine, it was for the establishment of a Jewish state, for a Jewish national home, a unique mandate. So what comes out of the mandate deliberations and the treaties that I've referred to is what you see in the blue there. Palestine was supposed to be a large territory, even larger than what the Zionist organization had asked for in Paris. And it's on both sides of the Jordan River. But the British changed the terms of the mandate, introduced Article 25. Don't have time to go in details, but it gave them the right, illegally from my perspective. It was later ratified by the League of Nations, but it was politically expedient as a result of the Cairo Conference of 1921 for them to separate, to partition Palestine and give almost 70% of it to the Arabs, even though they have no entitlements to that territory. Rights were given to other territories, but not to Palestine. So it's in Palestine that an Arab state is set up. The old Article 25 had nothing to do with the partition. It was changed by the British. So they present a memorandum later to the League Council, and they say basically, we want your approval for this partition. And what is really, really important is that even though it's taken away from the Palestine that was destined for the Jewish people, certain rights are to be protected and preserved by the British in that new Arab state, including the rights under Article 15. I hope you're listening to this carefully. There was to be no discrimination in respect to the Jewish people in the new Arab state set up with the Hashemite leader, Abdullah. 15 was supposed to be respected. 16 was supposed to be respected. No discrimination on the basis of religion. Well, guess what happened? As it always happens, Arab state, Jews have to get out. No respect whatsoever of the rights of the Jewish people set out in Articles 15 and 16 in respect to the new Arab state. And look at this map. I have an original of the map. And you will see there that in Palestine, here is a better view of it. In Palestine, an Arab state has been created. So what we're trying to do right now is to create another Arab state, this time for those who have renamed themselves, they're Arabs, but they call themselves Palestinians, so they can have another state when one has already been established, even though all of this was supposed to go to the Jewish people. So now that's what they were left with after the partition. The Treaty of Lausanne, because the Treaty of Sept was not fully ratified by the Turks, completes the legal picture and the rights that were given to the Allies and then to the Jews. Don't have much time to go into this, but the white paper is the ultimate betrayal of the British government. You know, the story of the British, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Without them, without the Balfour Declaration and their help in the early days of the mandate, the Jewish cause would not have been advanced the way it was. And yet, the new leadership in 1939 completely contravened the mandate terms and did something which was criminal and shameful, blocking immigration to Palestine and in effect adopting a one-state solution whereby Arabs would be the dominant population and Jews would be a minority in an Arab state. The absolute reverse of what was planned, what was protected in the mandate for Palestine. In the final resolution of the League of Nations that was dissolved, it's underlined that what happens next should take care of the well-being of and the development of the peoples concerned. The UN is required to honor the obligations to the Jews that are in the mandate for Palestine. Article 80 of the UN Charter makes it very clear that there's nothing in the UN Charter of 1945 that should take away from the rights given to any peoples previously. That completely protects what was granted before, what I've presented thus far. So what on earth is the UN doing, completely denying the rights given to the Jewish people? The partition resolution, just a couple words. It was a UN recommendation, UN General Assembly resolution under the charter, under international law. Those are not binding. If both Arabs and Jews had accepted to move forward with that plan, then it could have been part of a treaty and a source of rights and obligations. But as you know, it was rejected by the Arabs, who in 1948, when Israel declared its independence, immediately tried to destroy the brand new Jewish state. In 48, this is another key moment, because here, the Jewish people, by declaring an independence effective May 15, 48, in effect, appropriate a component of the rights that were granted before. It's not all the territory, but whatever is covered by the new Jewish state is a completion, it's a redemption of what they were given. The Balfour Declaration is mentioned in the declaration. Sadly, the San Remo Conference is not, but the historical connection, the recognition of it is mentioned. So this is a key event as well. Here's the Armistice Agreement, which I'd mentioned earlier, which says that in no way is this agreement to prejudice the claims of the parties. I'm going to stop here. I should mention the 67, of course, the war of 1967, resulting in Israel possessing the rights that had been given to it previously. So although Israel did not annex what is the disputed territories that you see in that map, did not annex the Sinai Peninsula, which was pursuant to a treaty with Egypt, was given back to Egypt. It did ultimately annex a big chunk of the Golan Heights. The point is this: had Israel annexed the disputed territories as it annexed ultimately Jerusalem, then they would merely have taken possession and acquired the rights in international law that were granted in all of the events, historical events and treaties I've mentioned. All right, Resolution 242 is another component of the story. It goes on. I'm gonna stop here just to give a chance for a few questions, Judy, but I trust that you'll understand how challenging it is to present all of the facts that support the legitimacy of Israel in respect to Jerusalem and the disputed territories. But I've done so for decades now around the world, and I'm telling you, the facts are irrefutable. They've taken place, and the results of those facts cannot be contradicted. This is the true narrative.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gauthier. I think I speak for everybody when I say that we probably could have listened to you for 2 or 3 times as long as you spoke, because what you had to say was so fascinating. And even for those of us who spend a lot of our time learning about these kinds of things and fighting for these kinds of things, a lot of what you have to say is in more depth, more detail, and just really fascinating. So thank you so much. We're very honored today to have amongst us in our audience some very strong Zionist leaders on this Zoom call. And before the call started, one of them, Goldie Steiner, who is the founder and president of Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights, sent in a question. And I'm going to start with that. And please, anybody who has another question, please add it to the chat box at this point. So Dr. Gauthier, first, it's a pleasure as always to hear your presentation. My question is how to respond to the following query. While Resolution 181 is not legally binding, however, Israel's Declaration of Independence states, the State of Israel is prepared to cooperate with the agencies and representatives of the United Nations in implementing the resolution of the General Assembly of the 29th November 1947 and will take steps to bring about the economic union of the whole of Eretz Israel. How do we respond to that?
Okay. Well, let's look at the context. This resolution is a partition resolution is 1947. The Declaration of Independence is 1948. 1948. The nations have just witnessed the massacre of millions of Jews. This is just, we're coming out of the Holocaust. And the Jews have been prevented as a result of the White Paper of 1939 from immigrating to the very place where they were supposed to establish their national home. Boats, as you know, came with survivors from the camps, and they were turned away, they were stopped by the British. So all of a sudden, in 1948, there's an opportunity to get the nations to support a state in a small component, in just a small component. And so the desire of the leaders, including Ben-Gurion, was for the nations to agree to something, and they were desperate. They were under duress. So I'm not surprised by the reference to the partition resolution. As a jurist, my comment is, so what? If Ben-Gurion was willing, even at that time, to go back to the configurations of the partition resolution, does it matter when the very next day, every neighbor came down and tried to destroy and kill all the Jewish people in the said territories? The British were supposed to have protected Jews, and they left on May 14th without protecting them. So whatever good intention, whatever, it's always the case. Israelis want peace, and they're prepared to make concessions to have peace. They don't want to have to go through wars. Can you imagine having to go through a war when they had very little armament and they'd gone through everything that they'd gone through in 1948? So I pay very little attention to that statement in the Declaration of Independence. Who would have the nerve to go back to that document, which was a mere recommendation, non-binding resolution, and suggest that some aspect of that is now binding on the Jewish state after they were almost completely wiped out by the Arabs in 1948 and 1949? Nonsense. So it's one of those things that people try to hang on to. And the problem is this, Judy. People don't know the facts and they don't know how to respond. So it's so easy to pretend anything and to cover it with legitimacy, and people don't know how to respond. So yes, there was a reference to the partition resolution, but as a jurist, I'm telling you, totally insignificant and irrelevant in my legal analysis.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question from Robin Friedman. What do we answer to people who say that Jews were like Americans stealing land from Indians? This was before San Remo, about the 1890s, and later. Some went to Palestine, which was uninhabitable land.
I'm not sure I understand the question, Judy.
I'm not either. Maybe Robin can write me again and make it a little clearer. Bernice Lipkin asks, why talk annexation? Why not say one sentence? Samaria and Judea are returned to previous status. And that's a question that I have for you also, because my understanding is that in legal jargon, annexation refers to the forcible taking of land that belongs rightfully to another sovereign country. And in the case of Judea Samaria, and in the case of the Golan Heights, and in the case of any of these lands, we're not talking about land that belong to another sovereign country. So I understand that even in Israel, they use the term annexation, but isn't it something that we should try to get away from? We should be talking about the application of Israeli law to these territories, or applying sovereignty. I know it's just semantics, but legally, semantics are important.
Okay, well, your comments are addressed to me, Judy. I'm a jurist. I'm an international law expert. Annexation is a term taken from different chapters of international law. This is a discussion not about political aspirations and what international law stipulates. So annexation is that. So let me say this regarding Jerusalem and the disputed territories. When the state of Israel decided to annex Jerusalem, it took an extra step and declared that Jerusalem was part of Israel. When it did that, in my view, it completed its entitlement, because it was given that territory by all the events that I've referred to, and then appropriated in the right way by Israel. In regard to the disputed territories, Israel has not done that. I should add, is there any reason today for Israel not to do it, not to annex components of the disputed territories or all of the disputed territories? Well, politically, it would be a very, very difficult decision with huge ramifications. But legally, I don't think there's any treaty in place now because of the violations of anything that was done with the Palestinians in the past, or even Resolution 242 of the Security Council. That's the one where Israel agreed to the wording that they would come out from territories, not all territories. Well, they have. They left Sinai. Furthermore, Israel agreed to come out if certain conditions were met. None of the conditions that are included in Resolution 242 of the Security Council have been honored. So if Israel decided to just go ahead and annex today, it would have the legal right, in my view, to do so. It could have done so a long time ago. Why didn't it do it? Did they not proceed with that after 1967? Well, lots of reasons for that, and I don't have time to go into it, but they could have. They could have. And if they had, as a jurist, I would say they just redeemed and appropriated what was given to them. And again, the circumstances are such that it's very difficult to do, but they have the right to do it.
Okay. I just have one final question for you, having to do with really recent events, the Abraham Accords. And my question for you is, there seems to be some dispute as to what the Arab version versus what the English version of the Accords say. And the Arabs claim that the Arab version says that sovereignty will be stopped, where the English and the Americans say that sovereignty will be suspended. What, in your opinion, if anything, did Israel get or give up for this agreement?
Well, we have to be careful here because I'm an international law expert on certain questions. And I don't want to be taken into a realm which is really pure politics. I have my opinions, I have my views, but my views are not any better than the views of anybody else that's listening to this presentation. So I'm interested in the legal aspects, and quite frankly, I would be very surprised if Israel had entered into an agreement which specifies that it is no longer going to be appropriating or annexing any component of the territories. In fact, if they had done that, I think there could be a civil war in Israel because so many Israelis would oppose such a disposition. So I don't have the text in front of me, and you know, I can speculate, but my impression is that in order to proceed with these agreements, Israel definitely agreed not to annex any additional territories at that point in time. I would be extremely surprised if, in fact, the commitment was an indefinite commitment, because that is contrary to everything that's been progressing and advancing in response to a lot of interaction between those who live in those communities. You know, if you take Gush Etzion, for instance, over 100,000, I believe, Jewish people live in that community. And there's no doubt in my mind that sooner or later, that's going to be part of the state of Israel. That's going to happen. But again, I've got to take you in another direction for a moment. Why are these agreements coming together? Why? Does it have anything to do with the Arabs suddenly giving recognition after denying the rights of the Jews for so long? Suddenly they realize that those rights are well-founded. I don't think so.
Well, obviously,
It has to do,
it's Iran, the threat of Iran.
it has to do with the enmity and the ongoing conflict for decades and decades and decades between Sunnis and Shias. And my study focused on what was happening in Arabia in 1920, 21, 22, and it was controlled by the Hashemites. And after everything that they did, guess what? A few years later, it's the Saudis that took over Mecca and Medina. The Hashemites were pushed out, and the only remnant that they have now is Jordan. But the real issue here is concern with regard to the Iranians and their determination to someday take control of the holiest sites in Islam, of Mecca and Medina. And they're strong compared to other nations in that part of the world. And I think many are maybe doubting the resolve of the Americans to defend them. And, you know, there are many sayings about, you know, strange alliances that come out of necessity. So I think that's probably a fair summary of the underlying reasons for those treaties. But I'm off topic.
Well, I thank you for just doing us the favor of going off topic for a moment, because obviously it's something that it must be on everybody's mind at this point. And hearing from an expert on international law that you do believe that this is going to eventually be something that is good for Israel is very comforting to me, and hopefully to many of the other people on the call. We are way over time. I know we started late, but and we have more and more questions, and clearly we have enough questions that we probably could do an entire additional session with you, Dr. Gauthier. You'll have to let us know if you're available at any point. But we want to thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your amazing PowerPoint and maps and original documents. They're all fascinating, and we have recorded them. I hope that's okay with you.
It is.
For people to be able to get onto our website and go over them, review them, and learn even more from them. So again, I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for being with us today, and thank you to all our Canadians who let us know how fascinating you would be as a speaker, and it's been a really, really wonderful session. Thank you very much again, and I want to say Shana Tova to everybody, and thank you for coming, and again, thank you, Dr. Gauthier.
It was a privilege, Judy. I thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Shalom.